Outside in the sun, everyone has a shadow. And in the digital world, everyone has a shadow too. Our digital shadows are created as we move through the digital environment, collecting trillions of bits of data which are stored in data centers all over the world. Unlike our ordinary shadows, our digital shadows have a life of their own. They can be affected by others, take on different forms, and change in unpredictable ways. Every time we use digital technologies, our digital shadows grow. We have no control over what our shadows may attach to or connect with. Likewise, as we interact in the digital community, it's hard to know what our shadows might be associated with and what this means for us. It's not only people who have data shadows. Institutions and companies, big or small, have data shadows too. Bits of our own data can get absorbed by others. Digital shadows can be seen in different ways, depending on who is looking at them. Having a digital shadow is unavoidable, but there are things you can do about yours. Do you know the shape of your digital shadow? Do you know where your data is? Do you want to understand more? Visit myshadow.org.
So you can just switch back to the presentation. So what I found interesting about this video, and this thing is kind of representative of a general kind of notion, or like kind of the status of the individual and the subject in kind of this data activists' critiques. It's kind of this idea of, well, the problem is obviously we're losing control. There was this idea that we have, like this is my shadow, these are my data, and what kind of has the solution is obviously that we have to get kind of back into control, that we have to know the shape of our shadow, that we have to know where our data is. And so this is like evident in the video that there's a focus on the individual or the subject, in that the subject is a very important place in this critiques as the one whose ownership of his or her data or whose privacy is harmed. The subject as the one who needs to be informed in order for it to take back control. And I think it's just, I don't know, it bothers me a lot, this notion of taking back control, kind of the stabilizing of the subject again. And I think it's in this kind of critiques, it doesn't problematize the position from which this kind of critique is formed. But it sees this already present, that there is obviously some kind of individual subject, and it sees that in the form of the ownership of data. It's kind of this weird subject that is constituted through its ownership. And I think this kind of starting point from this whole critique that I always take for granted, there's this individual, there's a subject, that was being harmed, and we have to put this subject back into control, is kind of why this critique is also not very effective. I think it's not very sparking a lot if we think about that there's that there's this problem they describe with big data and data surveillance. It's obviously a problem that affects a lot of people. Everybody who has a cell phone, everybody who browses in the internet are affected by these. There are obviously scandals once in a while, like in the picked up in the media, but the actual usage of these kind of devices and services don't really decline. So just as a recent example, if you think about Cambridge Analytica and the scandals surrounding that just a few months ago, I think it was with Facebook. There was some newspaper article also afterwards that the usage of Facebook and the numbers of Facebook users actually increased afterwards. So there's like really little effect of these kind of critiques. And I think that argument governmentality, or rather as I understand these kind of arguments by Antoinette Rouvois and Thomas Behrens, might be able to shed some light on it, especially the notion of that there's a rarefication of subjectivation processes. But before I go there, I'm just going to briefly explain what algorithmic governmentality is. So now that's you. So it describes the automated collection, aggregation, and analysis of big data so as to model, anticipate, and preemptively affect possible behaviors. Beauvoir and Berns refer, for instance, to the customization of advertisement, products, and offers, but also to big data-based decision-making, such as whether or not one receives a loan or whom to employ or promote based on one's profile. It's going to be black in between. Derived from the data constantly created by activities spanning from internet searches to walking through a park, profiles are basically patterns or correlations found in diverse data that allow predictions about future behaviors in the form of others that are similar to you have acted like this in the past, so it is somewhat probable that you will act in a similar way. Algorithmic governmentality describes the attempt to use these inductive and probabilistic patterns to safeguard investments against unforeseen incidents, and thus is keen to what Michel Foucault presents as the aim of governmentality, and obviously that's where maybe I'm focusing a bit also on this kind of notion of governmentality from Foucault. That's making possible, guaranteeing and ensuring the circulation of people, merchandise, and air, etc. That's from Foucault. Algorithmic governmentality is the pursuit to use big data surveillance to smooth the way of circulation and avoid any unexpected bumps. Algorithmic governmentality appears to be a technique based on specific knowledge about each individual, implementing a truth about each individual based on their personal data, and thus a method of identification akin to other forms of surveillance. This also seems where this subject-based critique by tactical tech, for example, falls in. Beauvoir and Berns, however, argue. Next one. Beauvoir and Berns, however, argue that algorithmic governmentality produces no subjectification. It circumvents and avoids reflexive human subjects, feeding on infra-individual data, which are meaningless on their own, to build super-individual models of behaviors or profiles. Thus, the interactions of individuals online and offline are made measurable, thus does not imply that individuals themselves become more visible and more intelligible. So rather than, if you think about this disciplinary society, which came up before, that there's this imprisonment into institutions, what Foucault described in The Birth of the Prison. Now there's not an imprisonment, but rather kind of almost ignorance towards the individual. Starting with the point maybe that the data is infra-individual, data has to be put into comparison with other data, so therefore it is stripped of the context from which it emerges and cleansed of any narrow meaning, Beauvoir and Berns write. While personal data like the content of a call might be very revealing, it has no value for this governance technique as long as it is not made comparable, i.e. generalized. In fact, the objectivity of the data and its analysis is constructed as the exclusion of intentionality and subjectivity. It is said to be objective because nobody has to give an account of the actions or interactions, nobody has to fill out any questionnaire, nobody has to interpret these accounts. Data itself is, according to Beauvoir, infralinguistic and asignificant. Furthermore, data analysis is automated to find patterns or correlations uninformed by pre-existing hypotheses, neither interpreting the data nor looking for a causal explanation. So again, it is objective by excluding subjective individuals that would stain these processes. So the first one is maybe that this critique by data activists that seek to create barriers around the individual kind of misses the point, since while digital traces are created through the actions of interactions of individuals, data is infra-individual and not personal. So this idea to just, if we have to kind of guard our personal data is maybe already kind of, obsolete if this kind of algorithmic governmentality doesn't require this data really to be personal. Additionally, Beauvoir and Berns argue that the profiles are super individual and that therefore personalization in the form of algorithmic governmentality does not produce subjectification. That's basically the first part of it. The patterns or profiles derived from data analysis are not meant to be perfect representations of users, but to be sufficient indicators for a strategy of action. For example, a bank's strategy on loaning. So if they, it's a kind of, if they give somebody a loan, if they don't give them a loan, and it's not really about if this person is really can actually pay it back or not. It's more about if in general, their returning rate for loans is increased, and while also increasing the number of loans they give out. So these function rather as a regime of operationality, Beauvoir argues in a recent paper actually, rather than a regime of truth. The results have to be reliable rather than accurate. Consequently, Beauvoir describes the relationship between the individual and the profile as a contagion rather than a close identification, as a propagation from nearby to nearby, revealing not an individual character, but the people, stores, films, or music one interacts with, frequents, watches, and listens to. Now, subjectification, they don't really explain the term and where they get it from, or like what they mean by it. It's kind of a general thing that they introduce, kind of make claims a lot and don't really explain it all that well, I find. But I think what might be can derived as is, well, what my understanding of subjectification then is, and not necessarily the one by Beauvoir and Berns, is that subjectification is a process of making and becoming a subject by becoming intelligible. So, for example, Foucault describes this he gives the example of the homosexual subject, which is constructed through a whole array of discourses in psychiatry, jurisprudence, and literature that try to identify what was now considered a personage or a species and no longer just a temporary aberration. And I'm coming back to that a bit later. So algorithmic governmentality, however, is a way to govern. So this is one way to govern people is to make them intelligible, or to control people is to make them intelligible. But algorithmic governmentality is a way to govern without making its objects intelligible, because algorithms produce actionable intelligence by contagion without having to understand what is behind these terms, without subjectification. And so now I'm coming to Simondon, because I think that they kind of point at the same thing by transferring this idea of subjectification into Simondonian terms of relations and individuation, and thus kind of elaborate a little bit more on the place of the individual, who is at the same time avoided in algorithmic governmentality and included through the digital traces it creates through the interactions. So they argue that the algorithmic governmentality is a governance of relations, and the quote is, "Our hypothesis is that the object, which therefore does not manage to become a subject of algorithmic governance, is precisely relations. The data shared are relations and only subsist as relations. The knowledge generated consists of relations, and the normative actions that derive from it are actions on relations or environments referred to relations of relations." And just a quick word on the governance part of that. We might see relations here in line with former objects of governmentality, such as population or the market, which were at the same time integral for knowledge production. In the market, this was, for example, was considered, the price was considered to be as the kind of the revelation of preferences. But these objects were also the aim of interventions. So Maria Mule, for example, argues that governmentality, as it was described following Foucault, can be considered a form of biopolitics. So there's not really a difference between biopolitics and governmentality, but that governmentality is a form of biopolitics because the object, the population or the market, are open to governmental techniques by viewing them as a living system. So the market is considered to be, for example, self-regulating, and thus, as a self-regulating system, also kind of a living system, or considered a living system. So similar to biopolitics that aims at increasing life by attaching itself to the norms inherent to life, governmentality thus tries to ensure that the market or the population can flourish. So there's no, governmentality or biopolitics is not about limiting things, but really trying to making them flourish. And obviously there's a whole thing of control going with that, but it's not trying, not by trying to kind of imprison them, but by kind of almost like liberating them. If in algorithmic governmentality relations are the new object, we can likewise say that relations are not just the elements of a new knowledge production, but that the aim is to increase and intensify relations. By focusing on relations, one might say, Beauvoir and Berns argue, that this fulfills the theory of individuation by Simondon. Rejecting the theory of substance, Simondon understood being through relations. Relations thus don't join two terms that are prior to the relations, but relations constitute the terms they connect. Likewise, one can speak of individuation when two orders of magnitude are brought into relation. Comp gives the example of the individuation of a plant. A plant brings together the light of the sun and the minerals, and thus is constituted as the interelemental node between the two. Individuals are what acts in relation and what results from it. She argues they are the activity of relations and get reality and consistency through relational activities. This concept of individuals understood only through their relations fits quite well within the notion of algorithmic governmentality, since this would imply that it is not reductive to grasp individuals in and through their relations. So it's kind of, like by data kind of being materialized relations and focusing on these kind of relations, there's maybe, in a sense, there's nothing missing. There's nothing beyond these relations. But just as algorithmic governmentality produces no subjectification, relations here are transformed in a way that resist a process of individuation. Still taking advantage of this, Still taking advantage of this comparison of a governance practice and Simondonian thinking, we could even go so far as to say that by being focused on relations, this practice is able to monadologize them, to transform them into states, even statuses, as if the relations were themselves individuals, causing them to lose Simondonian thinking, to becoming at work in a metastable reality. And I think, I don't know, for me it's a little bit, it's not instantly clear how there can be monads at the same time as, or can be transformed into monads at the same time as they treated as they were themselves individuals. But I'm going to try to elaborate on that a bit. Monads denote kind of these elements, I would argue, in the Simondonian thinking, of something that is isolated and closed off, according to the formula that by Leibniz that monads don't have windows. When relations are transformed into monads, but still are treated as if they themselves were individuals, we can say on the one hand that relations are unassignable to the elements they link together, and thus don't connect anything in a strong sense of the word. As is mentioned in a footnote, the word relation, understood here in the most basic sense, the least loaded, through which we qualify data, here only serves to attest to an operation which link A and B whilst being able to overlook what lies behind the terms thus linked. So, as a monad, relations in algorithmic governmentality just don't constitute individuals because they don't really connect anything, and so there's no process of individuation going on here. On the other hand, since relations are treated themselves as individuals, they now rely on this very process of individuation, gaining reality and consistency through relational activities shifted towards relations themselves, which as data only get meaning through their correlations. So I think with just I think that's kind of, for me, it makes it a little bit more. I think that's maybe how one can position this kind of weird relation from algorithmic governmentality to the individual as kind of this. It focuses on relations which are kind of produced, or which obviously implies the individual in some sense, but the relations themselves are focused on in a way that kind of cuts them off from the individual again, and isolates them from the individual. And so I just want to quickly bring this back to this kind of where I started, to this whole idea of critique. So this brings us then to the second point concerning the subject-based critique by data activists. Not only is the focus on personal data and personal privacy ill-fitted for algorithmic governmentality, but it shows that a critique in general relying on subjects who are harmed and who have to regain control might be misguided. It's not just about that certain critique is inadequate, but that the very possibility of critique is in question when the subject position from which to form this critique is not produced. By arguing that the problem might lie in the rarefication of subjectification processes, Beauvoir and Berns hint at an inherent collection between subjectification and critique. And here I come back to the homosexual subject from Foucault's example, because he says that these discourses, through which this homosexual subject is produced, enhance these enhance the social control and homosexuality, and other practices that were seen as perverted at the time, they also it also made possible the formation of reverse discourse. Homosexuality began to speak on its own behalf, to demand that its legitimacy or naturality be acknowledged, often in the same vocabulary, using the same categories by which it was medically disqualified. And so this is, just to bring it back, this whole idea that you can't, in order to form a critique, you can't just presuppose the individual as a subject which kind of voices this critique, but and that this kind of individual subject is not produced by algorithmic governmentality itself. And just a final remark then, that kind of as a conclusion maybe, that instead of presupposing the individual as a subject that can form this critique as already present, the conclusion would then be that one either has to engage in a form of opposition that is no longer reliant on this kind of form of subject, or one has to construct the subject proposition from which it forms a critique. And I think Rufa herself in a recent lecture kind of pointed at that this necessarily would be a collective subject, and she actually called for kind of try to find actually this collective subject in a form of statistics again, by saying that we have to stop hating the average and indeed have to love the average again, by which she kind of meant this average present in the statistics of Adolf Catlett as an average man, which is obviously not a singular person, but collective in nature. So thank you for your attention.